Good morning, everyone. Today's only the second time I've had to wear a suit. The first was when that photo was taken. Most days I wear hoodies, as most cyber people tend to do. I'm just kidding. Tony Vizza is my name. I'm an executive director with Quarter Mentha. So my job is to work with organisations, try to understand cybersecurity risk. Now, I've got about 40 minutes to try to capture virtually a lifetime's worth of learnings into a 40-minute session that can make this useful for all of you. So let's begin. So this quote that you see on screen, it's one issue, and that being cybersecurity, that keeps me up at night. That is not me that said those words. That is the Minister for Cybersecurity, the Federal Minister, Ms. Claire O'Neill, who is also the Minister for Home Affairs. So you think she's got a fair bit on her plate, but it's cybersecurity that actually bothers her most and really concerns her. These are very frank comments, and these were made after some of the mega breaches of last year. It is a really big concern, cybersecurity, and I'm sure that all of us have heard of it. I can see a fair few on computers and phones. It's all quite familiar to all of us in terms of what it can do. Any Optus, Medibank, Latitude clients? You can raise your hand. I reckon about half of you. Yep, correct. About half of you. So you get the scale, the idea of how important and how critical this has become. Some stats on screen. I'm sure a few of you might have seen the show One Born Every Minute. Well, with cybersecurity, it's one born every 7 minutes. A new cyber incident reported to the Australian Cybersecurity Centre every 7 minutes. Now, if you look at a data breach, the life cycle of a data breach, 277 days. So if you as a company get breached today, you won't know about it until the end of April next year. You won't know about it. So if you get breached today, you won't be aware of it. And you won't deal with it and kick the cyber criminals out of your systems until the first week of July next year. It gives you a bit of an indication in terms of what we're talking about here. Now, personal data loss or loss of money was involved in over 75% of breaches. These are stats from the Australian Cybersecurity Centre for last financial year. Let's talk about cybersecurity. What is cybersecurity? Well, for those of you that work in information and records management, the term cybersecurity is a sexy way of saying information security. That's what we did for many, many years. And in fact, before that, it was called information assurance. But I'll tell you what cybersecurity is not. Cybersecurity is not dude in mum's basement wearing a hoodie in front of a green screen, the ones that you see on TV. That is not cybersecurity. Cybersecurity these days is very much organised criminals, crime gangs. If you think of traditional things like the mafia and the triads and those sorts of criminal enterprises, they have moved away from physical and into virtual. It is much more lucrative. It is much more easy to make money when you're performing cyber crimes than it is robbing a bank. And that's where that traditional crime has now gone to. And we're dealing with really sophisticated actors in this space. In its purest form, cybersecurity is around protecting confidentiality of information, integrity and availability of information. And it's through using people, process and technology controls. Now, I'm going to dig through some of these just to give everyone a bit of an understanding in terms of what this looks like, okay? But before I do that, I want to talk about passwords. I'm sure that passwords is the one thing that every single person in this room has to deal with and hates dealing with. But you know when people like me get up on stage and say, you know what, you should have a strong password, letters, numbers, special characters, etc., etc. There's a really good reason for it. If you see up on stage, up on the screens right now, if you have passwords that are numbers only, or even passwords that are short but have special characters, for a computer, a modern computer, you can break a 4-letter password instantly. It takes no time at all through brute forcing, which is basically the equivalent of getting a lock and smashing it, right? The reason why we say get longer passwords or use passphrases is because they're infinitely more difficult to crack. And if you see letters, numbers, uppercase, lowercase, and symbols, 18 characters. Now, I'm sure most of you don't have an 18-character password, but I wanted to put this up to give you an indication in terms of how difficult it is to crack a password of that length. 26 TN is trillion years. That is a long time to break a password. Most often, people typically have a password of about 12 characters, are pretty strong to use, so try to use something in that sort of 12 and beyond characters, the longer the better, and use some special numbers, uppercase, lowercase, and symbols, of course. Talked about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. What is confidentiality? I'm sure those of you that work in information and records management understand. It's around making sure that only the right and authorised people have access to information, be it physical or be it virtual in our space. Integrity, making sure that people don't tamper with the information that you have, making sure that only authorised people can modify and access information. And then, of course, availability. Now, availability is an interesting one because for a lot of organisations who get breached, the first indicator that they have been breached is the availability, because they try to access something and it's not working and they don't know why, and they pick up the phone and ring up IT and say, hey, IT guys, girls, we can't get this thing, we can't access this resource, and they don't know why. So it's the availability, the fact that the information is not available when it's required, that's often an indicator of compromise. Now, I'll talk about factors for successful cybersecurity: people, process, and technology. Now, just before the break, we had 3 flight crew up here that looked a little bit suspicious, right? Because having a look at them closely, they had pink tyres. I've never seen Qantas or even Virgin or even Rex, by the way, fly in that sort of attire. But the reason why I point out flight crew is because if you know anything about aircraft, anyone fly here to get to the conference today or yesterday? Brilliant, okay. The technology, aviation technology, has been around for about 130 years. It is really safe. It is proven, scientifically proven. But how many of you ever watched crash scene investigation, any of those aircraft crash shows? Yep, brilliant. Why do planes crash? Yell it out to me. Yep, people and process. Usually it's people that make mistakes. Humans, we make mistakes. It's the character of our being. And process, we haven't followed the right process and things go wrong. Now, if you can get people and process down pat when it comes to cybersecurity, the technology is typically quite good. And even the technology, when it fails, has often failed because of some sort of people or process consideration. But we'll delve into this a little bit more today. So cybersecurity, one of the biggest challenges of cyber is a lot of organisations, they invest in cybersecurity, they spend money, they put in processes and technology and bits and pieces, but they do it once, they set it, they think it's never going to have to be dealt with ever again, it's all good, we've got it all under control. And I think we heard this morning Gus in his opening keynote talk about the fact that you always need to be on your toes, you always need to be one step ahead, to be thinking about as an organisation where you're going. And it's very, very true even for cybersecurity, because cyber's a life cycle. We have a preventative phase. We try to avoid things from happening in the first instance. We have a detection phase. We're looking for things to take place. Very similar to physical security. Physical and cyber work so closely together in terms of how they operate and the fundamentals. And I'll talk a little bit about why physical is a really good analogy to understanding cybersecurity a bit better. Response and recovery. You will have a breach at some point in time, and I'll keep talking about this today. But it's how you deal with that breach, what plans and processes you've got in place to deal with that breach, that'll be the difference between containing it and not having to do much more, and not being able to contain it and calling the regulator in and being on the front page of the newspaper. And then, of course, remediation. Regulatory and legal response, lessons learned, and ensuring that from a compliance perspective, you're doing what you need to be doing according to the law. And I'll also touch on the law today as well. I promised we're going to cover a little bit of tech territory today. Cybersecurity is often very difficult a concept for people who are not IT or cyber savvy to understand, and I'll show you why. And if you fall into this bucket, that's okay. And I'll also explain why in a second. So when we prevent as cybersecurity professionals, a lot of the preventative tools are things that you don't see. They're not like cameras in the physical world. There's a whole bunch of devices in here that make sure that people are doing what they're meant to be doing, for example, and outside. But in the virtual world, you don't see it. It's a dashboard on the computer screen. Very often, people who aren't in cyber or IT don't even know what they're paying for. They're paying a really big line item for something, and they don't know whether they're even getting it or not. And in fact, we're having a conversation this morning with a couple of the stands where there are a lot of clients who buy things and aren't even operating them because they don't even know, they have no visibility into whether they're actually there or not. When a breach occurs, I talked about the fact that very often the first indicator of compromise is something's not available. In the physical world, it's really easy to know. Something's been smashed, a lock's been broken. In the virtual world, you don't know, unless you know where to look, or unless you have some sort of really good concrete indicator of compromise that you can trust. So it's really difficult to appreciate as a problem what this looks like. And then in terms of investigation and recovery costs, well, anyone ever been broken in? Yep. Have you ever had the forensics come in and do the dusting and get the fingerprints and do all of that there? Yep. So in the cyber world, we do exactly the same thing. We're there looking at records, looking at logs, trying to understand who, what, when, where, and how. But you don't see it. Once again, it's a dashboard on a computer screen. Whereas the very physical world where you see people come in, you see the evidence getting collected, and very often you see the criminal get apprehended, and you might even have to go to court and testify. In the cyber world, that rarely happens, okay? So I like to talk about business disruption. So a cyber breach happens, a lot of people, a lot of organisations say, well, if we get disrupted, I mean, who cares? Well, let's talk about the physical world. Do you think this business is going to care that it's had a fire today? And I ask these questions almost rhetorically. If I was that business, the owner of that business, how much revenue do you think that business is going to bring in today? It's not going to be much, okay? What's the business going to say to its customers? Well, I can't help them. Sorry, we can't take your order today because we've had a shop fire, right? How much of that revenue is going to go to a competitor, not just today, but going forward? Because very often people are really comfortable with what they like. They like restaurants or businesses that they like dealing with. But the moment they get disappointed once, for whatever reason, is when they start looking at alternatives. And at that point, you start losing business, not just now, but long term. And then finally, how soon do you think before that business is going to be able to recover? It's going to take a while. It's the same with cybersecurity. If you have a small breach, easy to contain, easy to deal with. If you have a large breach, I can introduce you to a whole bunch of people who've worked on some really large matters. Some matters have even destroyed that business permanently. Now, I'm also mindful of the fact that cybersecurity is not the only issues that organisations face. People like me very often are very guilty of going in, talking to board, senior management and saying, hey, you got to stop what you're doing and deal with cybersecurity. It's a really big problem. Well, you know what? If you're a business owner or a board or a senior manager, cyber's an issue, and I get it, but it's not the only issue. I'm not going to go through all of these here, but I'm sure all of these are going to be familiar to everyone in the room. The one that I like here is the trade war with insert country here, because it depends on what day of the week. We're having a trade war week, but it often changes, right? So interest rates, ESG, competitors, et cetera, et cetera. Companies are dealing with a lot of things, and as a board member and as a senior manager, you're trying to juggle a lot. So I get it. It's still important though, and I'll show you why in a tick. I also wanted to point out supply chain risks. This is one that has existed since the dawn of time, but it's only becoming really prominent as a cybersecurity problem because of the breaches that we've seen over the last 12 months, particularly here in Australia. Supply chain issues with cyber have been around since the dawn of time. But if you consider your business, your IT services provider as an example, remember you're dealing with multiple service providers. And if you're dealing with that service provider, think about all of the different vendors and suppliers and products and services and personnel and everything that they've got. There's a really good story that a law firm that I work with once talks about with their supply chain. They once did a due diligence exercise on all of their suppliers, and one of their suppliers were quite proud. They put their hand on their chest and they said, we're all good. We have all of our stuff in the cloud. We know where it is. We know exactly where it sits, and we've got all the compliance under control. Fantastic. So this company was not short of $1, and they then said to the supplier, okay, we want to see what rack our information is sitting on. If you say you know where it is, we need to understand where it's sitting. And they start digging and they realise, actually, no, we outsource that storage to another provider. And that's fine, so they knock on the other provider's door, and this keeps going on until this particular company, their representative gets sent to India, to a location in India where their data was being kept. And they went to this address and they looked and they're like, oh, this is odd. This doesn't look like an address that's got a data center. It was an old rusty roller door, right? And it was a little bit open. They knocked, couldn't get anyone in. So they just opened it, and there are sitting all these racks with all their information, right? To give you an idea in terms of third-party issues and how far up the line it can go. And we've seen third-party come up with all of the mega breaches over the last 12 months. and then some. So cybersecurity is a big business concern as well. Now I said this, but I wanted to point out 2 stats that might be of interest to you. All of these stats really important, but let me focus on the cost per customer. This is just for credit reporting services for 12 months. If you get breached and you're holding financial data on that customer and you need to pay for Equifax or Vizza or one of those services to make sure that you can monitor and say to the customer, look, we're doing the best. 180 per client. Optus is paying that right now for all of their clients. They have to. This is a compliance problem because up until a year ago, that number, 50 million, was 2.1 million, the maximum cost for a data breach. It is now 50 million or 30% of the company's turnover if the regulator comes after you and finds that you've not done what you're meant to be doing from a Privacy Act perspective around cybersecurity breaches. So they are 2 really important figures that I ask everyone to keep in mind, particularly when we talk about some of the law developments that have happened in recent times. I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive with 2 Australian data breaches and 1 international data breach, talking about third-party risk. The first is Medibank. Now, I asked everyone before if you are a Medibank client. There's a fair few of you that are. Now, how it happened, I'm going to focus purely on how it happened. This information comes verbatim out of the Medibank half-year results for 2023. So this is a cut and paste, but I wanted to keep it there so that there was no ambiguity around what I'm trying to communicate here. The criminal accessed our systems using stolen Medibank username and password used by a third-party service provider. Sound familiar? The criminal used the stolen credentials to access Medibank's network through a misconfigured firewall. How do you think misconfiguration happens? People or process? Remember we were talking about that a bit earlier on? Yep. So the firewall's fine, nothing wrong with the firewall, that does what it's meant to be doing, but it was misconfigured. The criminal was able to obtain further usernames and passwords to gain access to a number of Medibank systems, and their access was not contained. That's how they broke in. 5.1 million customers, 1.75 billion wiped off their share value. There are a whole bunch of lawsuits and claims happening around Medibank today. Severe reputation damage. I'm up on stage talking about Medibank as an example, and a lot of people in my space are. Latitude financial services provider. This was actually a larger breach. However, the Medibank breach was probably of more significance because of the value of the information that was being held. Another cut and paste in terms of their ASX announcements here. The attacker was able to obtain Latitude employee login credentials. They appeared to have used the employee login credentials to steal personal information that was held by 2 other service providers. Makes sense? We're talking about third-party risk again. 7.9 million Australian, New Zealand driver's licenses. Information that was held all the way back to 2005. Does this sound familiar for those of you that might be in information records management? Yep, 2005. Impact of Latitude, they closed at $1.50 on the 30th of January. They were $1.12 on the 22nd of March. Numerous class action lawsuits, $76 million of pre-tax cost related to the breach. And that's just provisional. They haven't even gotten to the end of it yet. What was actually really bad around Latitude was that they actually functioned as the third party, again, to a number of retailers. JB Hi-Fi, Harvey Norman, Apple, Coles at one point, Good Guys. So a lot of Latitude customers didn't even know they were Latitude customers until they got breached and they were notified. SolarWinds. Now I like talking about this one because this one is a particularly nasty breach that happened a couple of years ago. SolarWinds is a product that is used to manage IT infrastructure. So if you think of your company and you've got all the IT environment, it's really hard to manage every single device one by one. So what you do is you get a platform that can manage all of them, right? So this breach happened because the cyber criminals, and by the way, this cut and paste over here comes from a US government report into the breach. Government Accountability Office published this. A campaign of cyber criminals perpetuated by the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. And what they did was they hacked into the database that saves the source code for SolarWinds. And what they did is they put malicious code into the source code, right? So think of a recipe. The source code's a recipe to make things, right? So imagine you want to spoil someone's recipe and you add a few steps in there that say, okay, you're going to make this really awesome cake. Put a few drops of this really nasty stuff in here, and it'll still taste good. They did that. They updated the software with their malicious code, and then this is what was really nasty about this breach. That source code, that malicious code, was deployed as an update to every one of their clients that was using SolarWinds. Remember, it's managing IT systems for an entire organisation, and remember, about 10 to 15,000 organisations around the world, including government departments in the US and in Australia. Now, there have been a ton of developments that have happened here. In the US, the regulatory scheme around boards and directors has seen some big changes, particularly over the last 12 months. And what you've had is the regulator, the Securities and Exchange Commission, issue what's called a Wells notice to current and former directors at the time because of poor disclosure around the breach. Big business problems. So I talked about the costs around breaches. This is what your share price looks like if you have a cyber breach, if you're a publicly listed company. That's Medibank's share price. That's the day they announced the breach. At first they said that they were breached, but they didn't think anything had been accessed. Then they said, look, we think something's been accessed. Then they said, look, a small amount of information has been accessed. And then not long later, they said, all of our customers' data has been accessed. And it's not short term. It can also be long term. This is a share price chart for a company called Equifax, credit services provider. They got breached back in 2017, 143 million records taken from the US. The law firm at the time that was working on this matter was asked by the US Postal Service not to send all 143 million paper-based notifications out on the same day because it would cripple the Postal Service. So they had to stagger it over the course of a week or so. 9 months later, they announced their disappointing third quarter earnings purely as a result of their data breach. Okay? Goes on for long term. Now, have directors' duties been tested in regards to cybersecurity? This is going to be the most legal slide I have, I promise. I'll try not to put everyone to sleep on this one. ASIC has confirmed that cybersecurity falls very firmly within directors' duties as high-risk areas for enterprise. Last year, we had a case, the RI Advice case, that was for financial services organisations that had an AFSL licence. And RI Advice did not get breached. Their authorised representatives that were independent contractors were getting breached. And RI Advice got done because they weren't meeting their obligations under their AFSL. Then we had the big breaches. And the one I haven't spoken about yet is HW Ebsworth. That was a law firm. That in itself requires its own presentation, but I encourage you to have a read of that if you haven't been directly impacted by that yourself, and I'm sure some of you might have been. That in itself, really big breach around a law firm that has basically seen everything go out the door. We had changes to the notifiable data breaches scheme as a result of the big breaches that we saw. The Privacy Act recommended a GDPR-style regime, as we have seen in the EU. We had a case, ASIC and GetSwift, that was around continuous disclosure. And the reason why this case was important, it wasn't a cybersecurity case per se, but because of what was happening around cyber at the time, in relation to continuous disclosure, a cyber attack could well be a material event which needs to be disclosed, and that was directly from ASIC. And since then, we've seen changes in the US. The Securities and Exchange Commission have announced what's called a final rule around cybersecurity accountability on boards. It is now mandatory for all US boards to have a person nominated as being responsible for cyber. It does not make them accountable for the company, but it does make them responsible at a board level for cybersecurity. 2 weeks ago, Joe Longo, the head of ASIC, said that ASIC will be very enthusiastically pursuing boards and directors for cyber breaches going forward. And just a few days ago, the federal government have agreed in principle or in totality to a range of the Privacy Act review recommendations that we saw earlier on this year. So there will be big changes coming to privacy. Now, What do businesses really care about? Two things. Sound familiar? Making money, saving money. The problem with cybersecurity is it's very hard to make money unless you work in cybersecurity. So why try to focus on the saving money aspect? What can you do to save money? Now, many of you in information and records management, of course, know this because you know that the more information you have, the more money it costs to maintain and uphold and protect and look after and manage, etc., etc. So very often a very valid cybersecurity risk management technique that we use is to reduce the information footprint that the organisation has. Now, to do that, you need to understand what the information is or what it looks like. It's also really good to mitigate cyber risk in terms of saving you money. Complying to regulation, you're going to avoid big breaches and big fines and big lawsuits. Improving governance as a whole. If you're doing risk management as an organisation better, not just cyber risk management, but all risk management, you're going to have better governance and you're going to be able to operate in a much more risk-tolerant approach, generally. Improved efficiency of IT systems. You don't need systems that aren't sitting there doing nothing. They waste money. You've got to keep them running. They've got to be maintained and managed. Get rid of all of that there. And better outcomes overall. Now, I like to use the Databerg. This was a study that was published by Veritas. It's a couple of years old, but the most recent information that I found suggests that the percentages that are here have not changed all that much. Most organisations know about 46% of their data is being classified or it's tagged. Out of that 46%, 14% of that data is what's called business critical, stuff they need to actually operate. 32% redundant, obsolete, trivial, no longer needed, get rid of it. However, this is what's scary, 54%, dark data. What is dark data? Do you have employees who ever take their phones out and connect it to their computers and sync it up to their computers and have whatever it is backed up onto your corporate device? Yeah? Could be dark data. Or people downloading things because you don't have the policies in place. Dark data. All of this represents risk. You don't need it as an organisation. Get rid of it and see if you can put in policies and procedures to avoid the accretion of dark data. I'm going to talk about some practical steps now to minimise cyber risk. First of all, this is a problem that is often defined as a wicked problem. You can spend nothing or you can spend every cent in your organisation trying to deal with cybersecurity risk. Now, depending on your organisation, will determine where you spend and what you do. And if you want to live in a world of ignorance, don't worry, don't do anything. And I'll talk about why that's not a good way to doing things in a sec. But you might be ASIO, for example. You've got lots to manage, maximum controls, expensive, very secure. Most organisations will fit somewhere in this space. And that expertise is often where those organisations lack in terms of understanding what you can do to implement things that will change your cybersecurity posture. Now, how thorough do you want to be? The question is, do you want to do nothing? As I said, probably not a good idea. You probably want to give your lawyer a call and ask them about Section 180 and 181 of the Corporations Act. That's probably not going to fit too well in terms of how you do things if you do nothing around cyber. Anyone heard of the ASD Essential 8? Yep, brilliant. Okay. So these are the 8 essential, I'll say it again, essential steps, right? The minimum, absolute minimum you should be doing as a small business, to manage. These 8 steps are 8 of these 37 steps that the ASD have created, the strategies to mitigate cybersecurity incidents. So these 37 steps include the 8 essential that I talked about, plus excellent, very good, and limited as well. So you've got a whole bunch of different steps that you can take. These may be appropriate for small to medium businesses. If you're a medium business or a small business with really sensitive information, very often what they're going to look at is they're going to look at doing a maturity assessment against what's called the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is a very common framework to do. And very often I get asked, Tony, which one should I do? The ASD Essential 8? Should I do ISO 27001, for example, which is the gold standard, all right? Depends on the organisation is the answer. And again, there's no right or wrong. Can you justify it? And what's your information posture looking like? Okay? So if you're thinking about what can we do around finding out from a cybersecurity risk perspective where we should be doing, just consider this and have a chat with someone who might be able to advise you the right way to say, okay, you know what, you're a big business, you've got really sensitive information, go off and do ISO 27001. Or you're a small business, go do the Essential 8. I'm going to briefly talk about the ASD Essential 8. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because, like risk, cybersecurity is everyone's problem, everyone in this room. It's no longer the IT person. It's not been the IT person's for a long time, all right? And you heard ASIC. ASIC are now saying it's the board and directors' problem. And if it's the board and directors' problem, it's everyone's problem, as we all know, right? So, application whitelisting, step 1. This is a really fancy way of saying if you need an app on your phone, on your computer, keep it. If you don't, delete it. That's all it's saying, all right? Because you're whitelisting what you need. And I encourage everyone after the end of today, maybe over lunch or when you're feeling a bit tired today, delete any apps on your phone that you don't need. The less you have, the better it's going to be. Patch your applications. Who loves patching applications? Go on, put your hand. Me, I'm one of them, right? Disable untrusted macros. Now, this has kind of fallen a bit out of favour purely because of the fact that Microsoft, in their infinite wisdom over the last couple of years, have realised it's a really critical attack vector through Microsoft Office macros, so they're disabled by default. However, you shouldn't enable them unless you trust them, okay? So if you're doing Excel or Word or whatever it might be. User application hardening. That is a fancy way of saying if you have an application and you have a whole bunch of options and plugins, if you don't need them, turn them off, because the less you have on, the less you're going to be able to get hacked, right? Restrict administrative privileges. Anyone here use their computers in administrator mode? There's a few hands, yep, okay. Don't. Disable it. Use your computer as a user and don't use your computer every day as an administrator, because that's how problems are going to happen. And you need to do that with your organisation as well. And the administrative privileges need to be tightly restricted and managed and monitored. Patch operating systems, do your updates. Multi-factor authentication. We talked about passwords at the very beginning. Switch on multi-factor authentication. And the best multi-factor authentication you can use is not SMS, because SMS is inherently insecure. Use an authenticator app. And then finally, daily backup of data. Back up your data. Everyone have a backup? Put your hand up if you've got a backup. Now keep your hand up if you tested it in the last 3 months. Oh, brilliant. There's a couple of hands up. Brilliant. Okay. Test your backup. I once worked with an organisation and I felt so sorry for this guy. Every day he'd plug a USB key in, a USB hard drive in, and it was part of his backup strategy. He had 2 of them, and he'd swap them around twice a week. And when I checked his backup, they had him backed up 1 in 10 months and 1 in 2 years. So he'd been doing this every day, right, for 2 years in one case, and it hadn't done anything, right? Check your backups. From a board and senior management perspective, some best practice cybersecurity from boards and directors. This comes out of the Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Centre, which is a government-funded body alongside the AICD. They published this last year. Set clear roles and responsibilities. The most common finding that I often realise when I'm working with organisations and talk to them around their cyber is that between their third parties, between themselves, internally and externally, there is no definition of who is doing what. And it's through those gaps and cracks that issues start to occur. Second of all, develop, implement and evolve a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy. Cybersecurity risk management should be another chapter in your business's risk manual. It really should be. It's no harder than that, but it's hard enough to be able to require that. It needs that focus and that mind share. Embed cybersecurity in all your existing risk management practices. This is another risk. That's all it is. And I know it sounds like a flippant comment, but I really do mean that. If you do this well and you have a strategy and a plan around how to handle this, you will be okay. Even if you get breached, you'll be able to manage it. And if the regulator says, well, what have you done about this? Well, actually, we had this, we did this, we invested in this, we did these things. And the regulators say, look, you're doing a lot better than a lot of other organisations are doing out there. We see that you're doing your best. But if a state-sponsored actor is going to want to break in, they're going to find a way. Step 4, culture of cyber resilience. We heard a bit about culture this morning in the opening keynote. One of the biggest guilt areas that people like me have is that we have denigrated people who don't know cybersecurity, and we've said really nasty comments to people in the past to say, oh, you know, you don't know anything about IT, you don't know anything about cyber. Well, I've often said to people, well, you know what? I'm not a doctor, and if I drink or eat the wrong thing, you know, like I'm not a doctor, I've never studied it. So how can I expect as a cybersecurity professional for you to know what's best practice? You need people like us to be able to help you and show you the right way and do it in a kind and a considerate way. Now that cyber resilience, that culture comes from the top. The board need to empower it, senior management need to empower it, and they need to promote it. One organisation, they give movie vouchers to anyone who reports a cyber incident in the organisation. That's a really good way of doing it. And then last, plan it for a significant cybersecurity incident. It will happen at some point in time, I promise you, it will occur. But if you've got plans, procedures in place, and if you're treating it seriously, you will be able to handle it and you will be on top of it, I promise you. Some resources, so I've got some government resources here, cyber.gov.au, CISA in the US does some really good work in that. A lot of these agencies actually work really closely together and they often will publish advisories jointly around cybersecurity. And I would encourage you, if you are not a partner of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre as a business, I would encourage you to become a partner. It is free and you get access to a whole bunch of really good and really free resources around threat intelligence, and get your IT and cyber teams on top of it. For small businesses, they publish a really good cybersecurity guide as well. And I'd encourage you to have a read of that. No nonsense, easy to understand and easy to explain. I'm going to finish up with some key takeaways for everyone in the room today. Cybersecurity, it's a major risk. We've seen it play out. It's a major risk from a reputational, a cost, a legal, a compliance, and a governance perspective. But as a risk, you can mitigate, you can treat, you can accept, you can avoid, but you're never going to be able to reduce or eliminate that residual cyber risk. At some point in time, it's going to remain. This is why cyber insurance has been so popular. For organisations that have done everything they possibly can to deal with the risk, they transfer it to a cyber insurance policy. Cybersecurity is very much a people issue first. People drive process, which is the second biggest category, and then people and process will drive good technology outcomes. Very often organisations invest and focus on the technology. More bits of tech will save us. No, it's good education and good policies and procedures that will save you. Resilience, iterative life cycle of maintenance, monitoring, response. Things change. A year ago, this thing called ChatGPT showed up that everyone's heard of now. And a year ago, this was all brand new. And people have already written malware using AI-based technologies. You can deep fake using AI. You can do deep fake phone calls and videos using AI. So these things change and your cyber needs to change as well. Directors are now under legal obligations. They have been for a long time. It's just that the regulators are now being serious about it. To manage cyber risk, you need to protect your digital assets. Prevention will always be far easier and cheaper than cure. 4 cents to the dollar to prevent versus the cost of dealing with a breach. It's not a matter of if but when it occurs, it will occur, but being prepared, like the old Boy Scouts, being prepared is always going to help. If you can detect, respond and recover. Practice. Boards need to practice tabletop exercise and scenario, and not just rehearsed ones, surprise ones. Do one at least once a year, maybe twice a year. Establish a procedure for the collection of evidence. So often we go into organisations who've been breached and we ask, can we have a look at your logs? And we realise that the logs have only been retained for maybe 30 days or maybe 90 days. And remember when I talked at the start, 277 days is the average life cycle of a breach? We have a problem in terms of establishing the evidence at that point in time. So that's going to be really critical. And then finally, ensuring that you have good, competent, and really business-centric advice in this space is going to be really critical. We know that what we're trying to do is empower businesses, and we know that what we need to do, it needs to make sense from an operational perspective. So as cybersecurity professionals, the way we think about it, the way I think about it is, how does the business benefit from this, and what's the best outcome for the business? And sometimes it's not putting more and more security in, because sometimes it's actually the worst outcome. If you've got any questions, My details are here. Feel free to reach out to me. Feel free to add me on LinkedIn if you are also using LinkedIn. And thank you so much to RIMPA. Appreciate the opportunity, and I hope that today's talk has been enlightening, surprising, and I haven't scared everyone too much. All right, thank you.